All right, so now we're live. So welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. Today on the line, all the way from Vancouver, Canada, or near Vancouver, Canada, I have Stephan Wiedner. Stephan, you are a psychological safety expert that has developed training to help leaders master their interpersonal skills, sort of in a nutshell. We'll dive deeper into this. But I want to start with the question, what does your virtual office look like? What do you need to get your work done?
Well, Lisette, I've been working remotely for close to a decade now. So I really pushed the envelope in terms of working remotely. And as you said in the introduction, I live close to Vancouver. So I don't live in Vancouver, which is where our company has been headquartered. Instead, I've moved a couple hours east up into the mountains a little bit. And I've been doing so for 10 years. And as a result, developed all sorts of systems to work remotely using Google Drive and et cetera, et cetera. So there was a time when, as a family with my young kids, I have two kids, I was able to work remotely. So we traveled to Asia, we traveled to Europe. And since kids are a little bit older now, they're in both teenagers. They wanted a little bit more of a stable home front, I guess you can say. So I've been just working from home and now have an office near to my home so I can actually get out of the house, because with COVID, it was suddenly all four of us crammed into one house all the time. And I think a lot of people could relate to that experience. And so I now have a little office that I can go to, but I work there on my own. I don't see clients here. It's purely just an extra satellite office outside of the home.
Yeah, indeed. I was telling my husband during the pandemic, like, I love you, but 24/7 love you it's a lot. So I can imagine there's a lot of
That's
families
right.
going through the same
That
thing.
that that's right. And since COVID, our staff is completely remote. So we have staff on the east coast of Canada, Australia. The bulk are still in the core Vancouver and area, but all of them are working remotely. In fact, we've given up our office. We maintained an office throughout COVID until very recently, 2 months ago. We just simply gave up the lease because literally nobody went to the office ever.
Interesting. So then, after COVID, people were not going to return, people were not returning to the office sort of in a natural way. And instead of mandating people to come back, you decided to get rid of the office. That is one of the choices that people are making. Others, are doing mandates, others are letting the team decide. Why give up the office? Was it just that people weren't using it, or was there more?
Yeah, people weren't using it, and we still have the opportunity to rent space, for example, when we have quarterly meetings and that kind of thing. So we try to get together and bring everybody into the same physical location, but we didn't need to maintain an office. It was purely a storage facility, is what an expensive storage facility, because nobody opted to go into the office. At first, some people had expressed the desire to be able to get out of their home and go down to the office, and yet it just wasn't getting used in practice. So we just got rid of it. Now we're
So
100% remote.
So we are going to dive into psychological safety shortly, which is your expertise. But I have one more question about that particular situation is when COVID hit, what was the most difficult thing for your team to go 100% remote?
It was not difficult, to be
Hmm.
honest. It was a quite a simple and easy transition. I think there was my business partner. He probably expressed some anxiety, and I did too, about people actually working. Are they putting in the hours? What are they doing? We just have to trust, focus on the deliverables, not on hours worked, that kind of thing, because psychologically we knew when someone was in the office, you can see that they're there, they're working. So I think for us as managers, it was a little bit anxiety inducing, but not really. I think we just shifted our focus on, well, are you delivering outcomes or not? And that's it.
I love it, right? Because you have to go outcome based when you can't be in physically based. It has to make that shift. How do you currently know what people on your team are doing?
Well, we have regular meetings. So every day we have a daily scrum where we check in and people give progress updates. We have weekly meetings to review how everyone's doing towards their bigger goals. And of course, monthly retros where we look back at the previous month, what went well, etc. So we're embracing some of the principles of agile
Uh-huh.
teams, right? Which I think you're quite familiar with.
Yeah, indeed. And I really think that Agile has provided the roadmap for good remote working, right? Like short sprints, like focused planning, retrospectives, like all of the continuous improvement, all the basic principles really lended itself well to remote working, I feel. So I was just really curious. So I do want to dive into psychological safety. And I would like to first start by asking, what exactly is psychological safety so that we all have the same vocabulary? Because I'm sure that my definition might be different from yours, but like, how would you define it?
So I have two definitions I'll share. The first is from Amy Edmondson, who's the professor at Harvard, who is really popularizing this term and really has put psychological safety on the map. And her definition is it's a belief that within your team, you can speak up, express concerns, frustrations, ideas without the fear of reprimand. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but I think hopefully you can get it. We've developed our own definition, which I think is a little bit more meaningful perhaps for people to try to implement, which is it's the courage to speak up and the confidence to know you'll be heard. So when you feel psychological safety, you have the courage to speak up and you have the confidence to know that you'll be heard. And those two halves are really important because we see, for example, out in the world, people protesting or they're holding their signs or speaking up against the board of governors or whoever, they're speaking up against. And that's a good first step to have that courage to speak up. And it's not enough to maintain psychological safety because in a psychologically safe environment, you also can speak up and know that it's going to be received. It doesn't mean there's agreement, doesn't mean the other
Right.
side, the other folks are going to agree with you. There's at least space for what it is that you have to say.
I love that. And in your definition with Amy, you mentioned it's like a belief that you can speak up without punishment. I like that. I like the idea of the confidence that you will be heard, that people will really hear what you have to say. And that's a whole, like being able to listen on the other end of that is a whole other ball game. That's very difficult. I know I'm practicing myself, but also that on a team that you can speak up and not be punished for having an unpopular viewpoint perhaps. So it's a great definition. Where do leaders usually go wrong when it comes to psychological safety on teams? Is there a specific place that you see over and over again, or is it a whole host of things?
Well, I'd say there's two common ones, Lisette. So the first is that when you look at why is psychological safety a thing, why is it that people aren't speaking up? Why do they not have the courage to speak up? You could probably relate to that experience. For example, anybody who's gone to school, we homeschooled our kids for a long time, so they don't have that experience of actually going to school. But for anybody who has, or for example, in a university setting, if you're in a large university, I remember my first economics class, Econ 100, there must have been 300 students in the classroom. And
Right.
you have to ask yourself, what prevents people from sticking their hand up and asking a question? Like what's going on between your ears when, when you're hesitating to lift your hand? And it's because um, you're concerned that what you ask as a question might have other people think you're stupid or that was a dumb question, or maybe your question will come across as being really controversial or against the grain kind of thing, and so you'll be criticized for just being that person, right? Well, these are the things that go on in our minds that prevent us from speaking up. And so what a symptom of low psychological safety often looks like is a lack of communication. So it's not that there's warring or fighting or people duking it out. It's just that there's quietness or compliance. And for a leader or a manager that's not tuned in, particularly well tuned into their people, they might see quietness as compliance and agreement. You see? So they
Or
think,
that things are
oh,
fine.
yeah, things are fine. Oh, I just asked employee X how they're doing, and they say, I'm fine. Well, during COVID, we know that I'm fine didn't generally mean I'm fine.
Right.
And there was a greater reception to the fact that I'm fine might mean I'm not fine. And here's all the things that are going on for me. So that's the first one. So that quietness or lack of communication is perceived as everyone's okay, everyone's in agreement, we're all good here. And then I'd say the second issue that we come across, and more particularly, I think within the training that we deliver, is that leaders will construe that second half of our equation, right, which is the confidence to know that you'll be heard. So in other words, providing an environment where other people are able to speak up and then you as the leader acknowledging what's being said, they confuse that with agreement. So they think, oh, if I give everybody the opportunity to speak all the time, I have to agree with them. And that's not the case, right? That is not a psychologically safe environment, one where no matter what everybody says or anybody says, you have to agree with it. So that's the first thing. And I think that leaders and managers can feel threatened, right? I have an idea, I'm trying to move forward in a certain direction. If I open up the floor, now I have to entertain all these other ideas, and that might affect the direction that we're heading. And I don't want to do that.
You're right. Well, fair enough, right? It's like if you're in a hurry or time constraints or somebody's pushing or the boss wants it or it's part of your, your annual goals or whatever, you got to, drive it forward. I can imagine that. So, how do I know if I'm a leader if I'm a good or a bad leader when it comes to psychological safety? Like if I, it's like, okay, people are quiet and compliant and they seem to be working. Yeah, how do I know if I'm good or bad in this area?
That's a great question. And that is one that a colleague of mine asked, or he helped me, I guess, shine a light on an answer to that question. I think if you ask yourself a couple questions, the first question is, how's your team doing? And if you're not really sure, then perhaps you don't have great level of psychological safety. Or maybe to think about even more extremely is you ask yourself, if any of my employees or staff came to me and told me I'm resigning, would you be surprised? Would that catch you off guard? That's, I think, a sign that you're tuned into your staff. You should know, or at least have an inkling of knowledge when people are really unhappy with their work environment and maybe leaving, maybe wanting or exploring other options. So, and coming back to my colleague, right at the beginning of COVID, maybe 6 weeks or 8 weeks into COVID, um, he's a learning and development specialist within his organization. They have maybe 1,500 people, so lots of managers in the organization. And he informally started to interview managers, asking them, how's your team doing? And it was bimodal. The results were bimodal. So he had half of his team saying, gosh, they're totally stressed out. I'm stressed out. I don't know how to answer their questions, such as, are we going to continue to work remotely? Are we going back to the office? Is my job secure? Am I going to lose my job? They didn't have answers. So they felt the anxiety that their team felt. Do you know what the other half said? The other half of those managers, they said, I don't know. To the simple question, how's your team? I don't know. So
Wow.
that means you're creating an environment where people don't feel safe enough to speak up and say what's going on for them. Because we all know during COVID, people were feeling all sorts of emotions.
Yeah, totally. And I was actually reflecting on how's my team doing when you asked that question. And I started reflecting and I thought, even I have a small team and we're really good friends. And even I actually have to really think about how do I actually know how they're doing? Because we take a lot for granted. I think that's a very simple and powerful self-reflection point that leaders can do to determine like, okay, is my team good or not? Because if you're plugged in and connected, you know
Yeah.
how they're doing.
Well, and if I could add even just a little bit more on that, even more specific,
Please.
Lisette, is that the psychological safety assessment we use, which is developed by, again, Amy Edmondson, it's 7 questions. And so I presented these 7 questions to a group of CEOs. And I said, okay, how would you rate the psychological safety of your team? And in this particular group, this one time that I'm thinking of, almost everyone said basically 8 out of 10. I think my team is pretty solid. Then I asked another question. I said, okay, how do you think your team would answer this? And suddenly they were like, oh, maybe it's a 7.5. Yeah, maybe still an 8. Okay. Then I asked a third question, which is, how confident are you that your team would answer these questions in the affirmative? And suddenly that's when, confidence started to wane. It's like, ooh, well, the beauty is psychological safety can be measured. And why keep yourself guessing? Why not ask it? Ask your team how they're doing, administer the assessment, and get those results and have it be transparent, something that your team can talk about.
I love that. And I'm a huge fan of being data driven wherever possible, and also having the recognition that tools are not everything. And you said there's like a humanness factor that will still need to be woven into any data driven strategy, right? And so in this case, I think where the humanness seems like it would come in is when you get the results. So what happens when you get the results of an assessment and it shows, probably like almost on any team, that there is work to be done? How do you focus people on what work they need to do?
Well, the assessment is just the beginning. It's really just opens up a conversation around the concept of psychological safety. And we look at, um, for example, we look at the concept of taking risks, because one of the questions in the 7 is all about, can I take a risk in this team? So psychological safety is this concept where you want to have people be able to speak up, and it's all around being able to try new things and learn, right? So that's why the most successful teams have the highest degree of psychological safety. Like those two things are correlated, because successful teams are able to learn, try new things, adapt, etc. And that requires a certain amount of risk taking. And so we can take the concept of psychological safety, which is kind of this big and broad and amorphous thing, and start talking about more specific things like, okay, so what does it mean to take a risk on this team? Let's say it's a legal department. How much risk do they want to take? And what does risk taking look like for that environment versus the new product innovation team, right? They're totally different, even if they're in the same organization. And so that's just an example of some of the questions and conversation that we can start to have around psychological safety. The other is we look a lot at norms. So how we try to look at, how do teams operate now? So when it comes to, let's say, risk taking again, what does risk taking look like on this team now? And what's the desirable outcome for taking risks on this team? And how do we develop new norms? We talked, I know you've done a lot of work around agile teams, et cetera, right? And having monthly retrospectives, and a lot of agile is about developing processes and systems. Well, those lead to norms and expected behaviors. And so we want to look at those a little more closely. Like, what are the norms within this group that facilitate psychological safety, and which are the ones that get in the way? Like, for example, one of our teams that we work with is in the financial sector, and they're pride themselves on having great skill and knowledge within the different markets that they work in. And so there's this immense pressure to be right all the time. And so there's a low tolerance for risk in that environment. And yet they know that if, let's say, 9 out of 10 people think buying company X is a good idea, they definitely want to hear from voice number 10 that
Right.
says, I don't think it's a great idea, and here's why. They want to know that dissenting voice. They definitely want to bring that dissenting voice into the room. That's not that they're going to agree with it and go, yes, okay, we better not buy company ABC. But they certainly want to hear from them, because maybe they're not seeing the full picture. But that creating that norm and that environment where people can speak up is more challenging than you think, because we all have these little voices in our head that say, don't be stupid, don't come across as not knowledgeable, especially when it's been reinforced for years and years within an organization or within an industry.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, I'm just thinking about to my own experience. Like, I am a fairly extroverted person and not really, I give presentations in front of groups all the time. And but even speaking up, I was thinking, like, I was at a game night last night where I didn't really know the rules of the game. And I was a little bit afraid of speaking up and asking about the rules because I felt like I was the dumbest person in the room. Everybody else seemed to have these like really good questions about like nuances of the rules. And I'm like, oh man, I still don't understand the basics. Right. So in a situation like that where you don't know people and there's a lot of unknowns and you are afraid to speak up, but that doesn't do anybody any good. I was the first one to get voted out of the game because I was sitting quietly and people mistook that for something more nefarious. It was one of these like anyway, it's a game where you vote people out or whatever. Anyway. So in any case, but I can imagine that this happens all the time. And if it happens with somebody like me, who's generally not afraid to speak up in front of a large group of people, then you can see that this isn't like a type of person. It happens with all of us in various situations, depending on how we feel in the group. The other thing that I like about what you're saying is that we want people to take a risk. And as a leader, immediately when you say that, taking risk, I got red flags going off like, hey, I don't want my team to take too many risks. Like, I don't want them to tank the company kind of risks. And then you allay my fears by saying, I want to have a conversation about what that means on a team to take risks. What is risky on a team? And then I think, of course, I could tell my team, like, hey, if it's less than 500 euros, you don't need to ask me, just spend it and let me know. But if it's more than that, like then we got to talk about the budgets and things. So I can imagine that there's all these different conversations that you start to have on a team about who can make what decisions and what do we want. So, okay, that's a really long lead in. So in terms of what's in your training, I can imagine it's more than just the assessment and a debrief. How do you train leaders to promote better psychological safety? What's a little bit involved?
Well, we focus on those two halves that I talked about. The first half being the courage to speak up, and then the second half being the confidence to know you'll be heard. So, as a leader or manager, you need to create that environment where folks have the courage to speak up and the confidence to know that when they do, they'll be heard. So, what we work on are interpersonal skills. We look at psychological safety. I talked about norms, group norms, and you talked beautifully about entering this new environment where suddenly your antenna are up going, okay, what's acceptable behavior in this new environment that I'm totally unfamiliar with, right? We all have these social antenna picking up all these different cues. And so what we train folks in is these interpersonal skills, because psychological safety really, in a way, is the grand sum of all these tiny little micro communications that happen every single day. And so we are drawing from experience in the world of counseling. So why are we looking at counseling? Well, it's surprising the number of parallels, because what is a counselor trying to do? A counselor works with an individual or a couple or a group of individuals to help facilitate better outcomes for that particular individual, or for that couple, or for the individuals within the group, right? They're basically facilitators facilitating outcomes. And what they've discovered in the world of counseling is that the best counselors, no matter what methodology or approach they use, because of course there's all sorts of different counselors and therapists, etc. No matter what methodology they use, the best ones, all the ones that get the best consistent outcomes year over year over year, are the ones that possess what they call in some circles common factors, or the term we use is facilitative interpersonal skills. So it's basically the ability to tune in to the people in the room and approach conflict. So it's really about conflict and being able to approach it in a skillful way, so that, because let's face it, in counseling you're going to encounter people who are aggressive or disagree with you, etc., and you need to be able to maintain empathy throughout all of that. So it's a kind of a combination of empathy and skillfulness with approaching topics that are really uncomfortable, where there's potentially conflict or disagreement. And so we look at that parallel and go, that's the same stuff that leaders need. Leaders who are facilitating outcomes for their team, right? They're not doing the work, they're facilitating the work of the people within their team. They need to be able to skillfully approach conflict and challenges when they arise, and also have empathy and maintain empathy. So it's this desire, this willingness to see the world through other people's eyes. That's really important. And we teach people that because it's easy to say, oh, I have empathy. And then it's another to actually have empathy and to express it. To say, I not just use the catchphrase, I get you, or I understand, but to actually communicate and say, oh, I understand that you're feeling really frustrated because the instructions are unclear. And then, did I get that right? So see how that simple addition of a reflection of what they just said, maybe expressing their emotion as well, and then checking in, gives the other person the opportunity to say, it's not really frustration. It's more sadness. Like, I'm sad that I can't get my work done because I don't know what the instructions are.
Right. And so this is a skill and that you're teaching people. This is not like a thing that we are born with and some people have it and some, but it's actually a skill that we can learn.
100%. Now, some of us are more skilled naturally than others for whatever reason. Maybe it's their upbringing, the environment they've been in, etc. No doubt about that, because and the same is true for counselors.
For
So
anything.
they,
Well, but for
right?
anything, right? Like
Sure,
Jimi Hendrix,
exactly.
well, he learned and he was like super skilled somehow, right?
That's right. And I think those who become really masterful at guitar or playing sports or whatever it is, they have a combination of two things. Number one, they have some natural skill, but perhaps the thing that trumps it more than anything is a propensity and a desire to want to improve and spend the time to practice, right? They're
Yeah.
willing to spend those uncomfortable hours working on the skill and the craft to get better and better and better. And so there's well-known principles about how to get better, because I know for me, myself, I've reached a significant plateau when it comes to learning to play the guitar. I picked it up about 5 years ago. And I've reached a plateau because I'm not using the key principles of deliberate practice. I'm spending time on the guitar. I'm just riffing and playing, the same chords that I've played all along and the same songs I've been playing, but I'm not getting any better because I'm not using deliberate practice. I'm not working with a coach, or I'm not working with an individual that's supporting me and saying, here's what you need to do next. Here's the thing that will push you to the next level. So in our training, we embrace those principles of deliberate practice to have people practice these skills. It's a muscle. You have to strengthen it. And for those who are naturally good at it, naturally good at listening and asking questions, being curious with their team, now they can do it with more conscious competence, as
Yeah.
opposed to just being unconsciously competent. So that now when someone says, boy, how did you do that? They can give you an answer. They're not going to just say, I don't know. I
Right.
don't know. I just do it. How come you
Right.
don't
Which
do
is
it?
not helpful
Right?
to any of us trying to learn. Right. So I
Right.
feel at ease because I know that one, it can be measured, and two, that there is a methodology that even if you don't know what you're doing, you can follow the methodology. Somewhat like it reminds me of nonviolent communication, right? It's very similar in that step. Like even if you don't know what to do, you can follow the formula, right? Where you start with setting the context, and then you state how you feel, and then right? Like and then when you do that over and over again, it becomes a more natural way of communicating with people. And some of these things just improve. And what I know from teaching workshops is the more that we have in our toolbox when it comes to being able to facilitate conversations with other people, the better that it is, right? So whether it's clean language or liberating structures or the psychological safety training that people go through for you will not come out worse of a person after these things. So and I would say for leaders right now, one of the big things that I'm hearing is that it's the leaders that are struggling in this new hybrid or in this remote sphere the most, because there's more unknowns in the remote space. So for one of our final questions, which is like, I can't believe we're running out of time already, but for one of the final questions, I want to ask, have you noticed there's a difference between psychological safety on virtual teams versus in-person teams?
Well, the biggest difference was that is obviously the fact that when you're in a room physically with people, and not necessarily in a room, could be walking down the hall, etc., you pick up on so many more cues, right? All that nonverbal communication that we're all really adept at picking up on. It's there, or we can all relate to that experience of walking into a room and feeling the tension in the room, right? That we are social beings that pick up on these kinds of things really well. And it's harder to do that in a remote setting environment when we're all talking on Zoom, or some people have video on, some people don't, etc. So as a leader and a manager, it's, I'd say, doubly hard to make sure that you know how your team is doing. And it requires extra time and effort to make sure you're checking in with people regularly and you're giving them the opportunity to speak up and share what's going on with them. And I'd say that's the biggest difference that we see is that you just have less data to work with as a leader and manager because you just don't see the people all the time. They're working remotely.
Right. So it's a deliberate, proactive use of our time to check in more with our team because we can't see them. We just simply don't know how they're doing unless we deliberately go in and ask.
100%.
Love it. I think that's a very clear distinction. So the principles behind psychological safety, the courage to speak up and the confidence that you will be heard, those principles stay the same whether you're remote or in person. But when you're remote, you have to have a more deliberate practice and more, I would say, agreeing on the team norms together for what some of these things mean, having a shared vocabulary of what risk means and what psychological safety. I mean, I love the idea of just ask your team, what do they need to feel psychological or to feel safe enough on a team to speak up? I bet that's a powerful conversation, either one-on-one or together. So last couple of questions as we near the end of this. One is, where would you suggest people start? So clearly they've got to take your assessment and get the debrief with you, and we will link to that in the show notes. But like if people are really more curious about, how could I improve psychological safety or my interpersonal skills besides taking your training, where would you point people to start? What's something that I could take back to the office immediately?
Well, I think there's some really practical tips and tools on if you Google Project Aristotle, Google Project Aristotle. So that's the project developed by Google to explore what makes an effective team. And they really helped popularize the term psychological safety in some circles because here's this tech company, immensely data driven, and they looked at 250 different factors correlating with team performance, and nothing correlated. So none of these factors correlated until they came across the concept of psychological safety. They applied that to their data
Wow.
set, and lo and behold, wow, they discovered the best teams have a high degree of psychological safety. The worst teams have a low degree of psychological safety, and so on. So those two conditions correlated. And beautifully, if you Google it, you'll get to Rework, which is a blog or a resource space that has some suggestions for and worksheets and so on that you can bring in to your team. So I think that's a lovely resource that everyone can check out as a starter, as a primer, to start talking about psychological safety within your team.
Right, and it's a credible source, very famous project indeed, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well. And then the last question is, when people want to learn more about you and more about your assessment, your psychological safety assessment, where should they go? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so our website is zarango.com. So that's our training, so we have a number of organizations, or a number of different brands, I guess you could say, within our organization. And the training aspect that's focused on psychological safety is called Zarango. So zarango.com, zarango.com. And if you go to /free PSI, then you can get a free psychological safety assessment. So one of our facilitators will help administer the assessment. That's we call it the PSI, which is the Psychological Safety Index. So free PSI, and we'll administer that assessment for your team and debrief the results with your team. So this is with a trained facilitator all for free to get you started on your journey of exploring psychological safety.
That's amazing. I don't know why people wouldn't do it. I mean, you have the chance to like measure and talk with an expert about it. Seems like a great, I mean, if nothing else, it's a really powerful team building activity, right? And always a good conversation starter. Stephan, I really appreciate your time and the valuable insight that you gave us today. I took copious notes here, as you can see on my pad. I have tons to add. So I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisette. It was a real pleasure. And I know you've been a trailblazer in terms of this whole remote work thing. And so when COVID came along, I think you're probably the right person in the right place, having already spoken a lot about this topic, right?
It was busy. It was busy times. I was, I
Yeah,
was really grateful that I had a team and a system set up for when that hit, because that was one big
yeah,
tidal wave. But as we saw, psychological safety is now more important than ever on all of these teams. So I'm really happy to be diving deeper into this topic with you. Thanks again.
yeah.
All
You're
right,
welcome. Thank you.
everybody. Until next time, be powerful.